I want to welcome Aaron Friedman to talk about the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Orphan Drug Act, and to also talk a little bit about how other countries handle the same issues. So Aaron, I want to thank you. He's coming to us from Maryland, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Chris. I'm looking forward to talking about FDA's role in supporting drug development and treatments for rare diseases. Let me get my slides going. And I'm going to put it in presentation mode. So if you don't see my slides, let me know, but I'll go ahead.
Okay,
thank you for that. Great. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Aaron Friedman. I'm a senior regulatory counsel in FDA's Office of Orphan Products Development. And I'm planning to talk about FDA's role in supporting the development of treatments for rare diseases. Throughout the presentation, I hope to cover why the Office of Orphan Products Development was created, how OOPD works with stakeholders to support the development of products for rare diseases, and how the Orphan Drug Designation Program drives innovation and treatments for rare diseases. And at the end, I'm happy to take all of your questions. So any discussion about developing treatments for rare diseases starts with the patients. And I'm sure you've seen these statistics throughout the past 2 days. There's about 7,000 known rare diseases. Individually, each disease affects a small population, but together in the US, rare diseases affect about 25 to 30 million Americans, and obviously many, many, many millions more worldwide. Rare diseases are often very serious. They're chronic, progressive, life-threatening, and fatal. Before the passage of the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, there was a lot of difficulty getting sponsors or drug developers to pay attention to rare diseases. In the decade before 1983, only 10 new treatments had been approved for rare diseases. There's significant challenges to developing products for rare diseases. I've heard many of those challenges covered in previous presentations, including the small patient size, geographic isolation of those patients and the researchers, and sponsors not seeing a financial incentive in researching rare diseases and treatments. Oftentimes, we've seen these drugs become abandoned by pharmaceutical companies, and that's where the term orphan drug comes from. Drugs that were abandoned either in development or after development without any sponsor to take them forward for rare disease patients. So in 1983, the US enacted the Orphan Drug Act, which was a monumental legislation that aimed to incentivize the development of treatments for rare diseases. The act defines what a rare disease or condition is and created programs that would help provide financial incentives to support the development of products for rare diseases. These programs include the Orphan Drug Designation Program and the Orphan Products Grant Program, and I'll be speaking about these in more detail. The definition of rare disease as established in the Orphan Drug Act, and to be more specific, the Orphan Drug Act after it was amended a year later in 1984, the definition of rare disease means that it's a disease that affects less than 200,000 patients in the US or affects more than 200,000 patients in the US, but for which there's no reasonable expectation that the cost of developing and making available in the US a drug for such disease or condition will be recovered from sales in the US of such drug. And that second part of the definition is a mouthful. It's essentially it means that the sponsor would not be able to recover their costs for developing the drug. And as I'll talk a little bit more about later, that part of the definition of rare disease does not get invoked very often. For the most part, we would say that the Orphan Drug Act generally defines a rare disease as a disease that affects 200,000, less than 200,000 persons in the US. As I said, the Orphan Drug Act created the Orphan Drug Designation Program. An orphan drug is a drug or biological product, and I'll use the term drug to mean both throughout this presentation, So an orphan drug is a drug or biological product for a rare disease or condition. And when it says for, that means treatment, prevention, diagnosis. Oftentimes we will just say for or treatment, but that covers treatment, prevention, and diagnosis. And so the Orphan Drug Act created Orphan Drug Designation, which is a status where a sponsor can request designation from the FDA. And if the FDA finds that this drug is a drug for a rare disease or condition, the sponsor may be eligible for certain financial incentives that come with designation to help the development of the orphan drug. And I'll get more into some of those details later. The Orphan Drug Act also created the Orphan Products Grant Program with the goal of supporting research of promising therapies for rare disease patients. This program over the years has facilitated over 70 product approvals for rare diseases. Something to note is that orphan drug designation is not a prerequisite for grant eligibility. The Orphan Drug Act created both programs, but orphan drug designation is not necessarily related to the Orphan Products Grant Program. And so why was the Office of Orphan Products Development created? OOPD was established in 1982, anticipating the passage of the Orphan Drug Act. The vision of the office is the availability of safe and effective products for patients who live with rare diseases. The office's mission is to advance the evaluation and development of products, including drugs, biologics, devices, and medical foods that demonstrate promise for the diagnosis and or treatment of rare diseases or conditions. To show you where OOPD resides within the FDA, this is an org chart showing the high level of FDA below the Office of Commissioner. The red box is the Office of Clinical Policy and Programs, and that's where OOPD resides. For context, highlighted in blue are the Medical Product Review Centers. These are the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, and the Oncology Center of Excellence. You may have heard of these centers, and this is where the marketing applications for products are reviewed. OOPD exists outside of that. OOPD oversees several designation programs related to rare diseases and several grant programs related to rare diseases. However, OOPD is not involved in the marketing application process. And so when I talk about orphan drug designation, it's actually a separate process from seeking marketing approval, which is housed in the medical product centers. And it's important to note that FDA considers drugs for rare diseases to be held to the same rigorous standards as any other drug. And rare disease patients deserve safe and effective treatments just like patients of any other disease do. So within OOPD, our core programs include 3 designation programs and 3 grant programs. I'll be going through each of these in the presentation, but just to introduce them, the designation programs include Orphan Drug Designation, the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation, and Humanitarian Use Device Designation. And the 3 grant programs are the Orphan Products Clinical Trials Grant Program, Pediatric Device Consortia Grant Program, and Orphan Products Natural History Grant Program. So to start with the Orphan Drug Designation Program, the goal of the program is to stimulate the development of drugs for rare diseases or conditions. As I said, the Orphan Drug Act introduced financial incentives that go along with orphan drug designation. And those have been added and changed over the years because the Orphan Drug Act is a living document and has been amended over the years. Currently, the incentives associated with orphan drug designation include a 25% tax credit for qualified studies, exemption from the marketing application user fee. This is sometimes referred to as the PDUFA fee, or the fee that the sponsor would pay when submitting a marketing application. And this fee currently is around $3 million. And so exemption from that is a large incentive. In addition, a sponsor with orphan drug designation may be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity, which is a 7-year period of market exclusivity for an approved orphan indication. And so it's important to note that these incentives are meant to help drive research and innovation in rare disease drug development. The incentives are narrowly tailored so that they only apply to development for the rare disease. So the qualified studies for the tax credit have to be for the sponsor studying the drug in the rare disease for which it's designated. Similarly, the exemption for the marketing application. The marketing application cannot be seeking a common indication, a common disease indication. And similarly, orphan drug exclusivity only applies when that drug is approved for the rare disease use, and not if that same drug is also approved for a common disease. Lastly, the definition of a rare disease or condition, as we discussed and established in the Orphan Drug Act, is that the population affects less than 200,000 persons in the US, or if it affects more than 200,000, there's no reasonable expectation of cost recovery. It's important to note that of the over 5,000 orphan drug designations granted by OPD, all but 3 have been based on the population definition. That is the main definition for rare disease for orphan drug designation. There have been 3 designations based on cost recovery, but we don't see very many sponsors requesting designation based on that or becoming eligible. Important distinctions between orphan drug designation and orphan drug exclusivity. Orphan drug designation is the status that a drug has recognized by FDA that the drug is a drug for a rare disease or condition. Orphan drug exclusivity is one of the incentives that may flow from that. And you see orphan drug designation, orphan drug exclusivity at different stages of drug development. A sponsor must request orphan drug designation before submitting their marketing application. Orphan drug exclusivity happens when the sponsor's drug is approved for marketing for an orphan indication. And at that point, OOPD will evaluate whether the sponsor is eligible for orphan drug exclusivity, and the effective date of that exclusivity is the marketing approval date. One other distinction between orphan drug designation and orphan drug exclusivity is that orphan drug designation is for a drug for a specific disease or condition, whereas orphan drug exclusivity is for a drug for the approved use or indication. Sponsors often seek orphan drug designation early in drug development, before they know exactly how they're going to study the drug, what data they'll have that will end up showing safety and efficacy in a certain population. And so FDA grants designation for the drug for the whole disease or condition so that it encourages the sponsor to study the drug in as many patients with a rare disease as possible. When the drug is eventually approved for marketing, that approval is based on the data that establishes safety and efficacy in a particular use or indication. So the drug's only approved for a particular use or indication, and the orphan drug exclusivity reflects that particular use or indication. So another way of saying it is that orphan drug exclusivity is often more narrow than the overall designation. A little more information about orphan drug exclusivity, kind of getting into the weeds. How is a sponsor eligible for orphan drug exclusivity? Well, first of all, OOPD makes this determination after marketing approval. A sponsor with designation for their drug may be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity if it is the first approval for that drug for that use or indication. That means that the Orphan Drug Act does not encourage serial exclusivity, where the sponsor can receive exclusivity for the same drug that's already been approved. If the same drug has already been approved for the same use or indication, the only way that the sponsor is eligible for exclusivity is if it demonstrates that its drug is clinically superior to the previously approved same drug. And I'll get into the definition of that in a second. But the overall point is that the Orphan Drug Act is encouraging the development of new drugs for rare diseases, better versions of drugs for rare diseases, and new indications. So if a sponsor is only approved for a narrow indication within the rare disease, the sponsor may get a subsequent approval for a different indication within the same rare disease, and that indication may be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity. Finally, what is the scope of exclusivity? What does it mean to have exclusivity? If a sponsor has orphan drug exclusivity for their drug, FDA may not approve another sponsor's application for the same drug for the same use or indication for 7 years. And you'll notice that the exclusivity is tied to the approved use or indication and doesn't go beyond that. So it doesn't block approval for a different drug. It doesn't block approval for a different indication. It only blocks approval for the same drug for the same use or indication. And so the concept of same drug is very important to orphan drug designation and orphan drug exclusivity. And the orphan drug regulations define same drug for a small molecule drug to mean the same active moiety, for a large molecule drug to mean the same principal molecular structural features. The definition also says that if a subsequent drug is clinically superior, it's no longer considered the same drug. And that gets at what I was talking about earlier as to how we encourage the development of better drugs for patients than the existing version of the drug. And the orphan drug regulations define clinically superior as a drug that provides significant therapeutic advantage over an approved drug that is otherwise the same drug. And that's through either greater effectiveness, greater safety, or a major contribution to patient care. So since the beginning of the Orphan Drug Act and the Orphan Drug Designation Program, FDA has granted over 5,800 orphan drug designations that have led to over 950 approved indications, and those indications are within more than 250 rare diseases. I've listed some recent approvals here, and I'll also note that a great statistic from 2020 was that of the 53 novel or new drugs that CDER approved, the Center for Drugs, of those, 31 or 58% were new drugs for rare diseases. So we're seeing the number of drugs being approved for rare diseases go up year after year and reach new heights like this. Here are some trends in orphan drug designation. This only goes back to 2012, but you can see that the number of requests for designation has gone up over the years to a new high in 2020 of receiving 753 requests for designation and granting 476 requests for designation. These charts break down the year 2020 by designation and approval into treatment category. And one thing to notice is a large portion of the pie is taken up by oncology drugs. There's a lot of movement in that space on rare disease drug development, and that's followed in these charts by neurology. So moving on from orphan drug designation to the other designation programs in OOPD. We have the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation Program. And the goal of this program is to stimulate the development of drugs for rare pediatric diseases. And Congress created this incentive for a rare pediatric disease priority review voucher. Priority review is a review clock for a marketing application that's quicker than the normal review. The normal review clock, I think, is about 9 months, and with priority review, it's 6 months. So if a sponsor can get their product reviewed in the 3-month shorter timeframe, that's a huge incentive to them. So what the priority review voucher is actually an award for an approved rare pediatric disease product. If a sponsor develops a product for a rare pediatric disease and the application meets all the criteria for the program, the sponsor gets this voucher as an award, not for that product, but to use for a subsequent product. And therefore, the incentive works because the sponsor wants to develop this rare pediatric disease so that they can then use the voucher for a different product that they want a shorter clock on. The sponsor may also transfer the voucher, including by sale, and that's a way to generate money, which works as an incentive for the sponsor to earn the voucher by developing a rare pediatric disease product. A rare pediatric disease is defined as a rare disease or condition using the same definition as the Orphan Drug Act. and the disease is serious or life-threatening, and the serious or life-threatening manifestations primarily affect children. OOPD and the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics oversee the designation part of the program. A sponsor can request designation for their drug as a drug for a rare pediatric disease. If we agree that their drug is a drug that meets the criteria for being for a rare pediatric disease, we'll grant designation. However, designation does not guarantee voucher eligibility. It just means that we agree that their product is a drug for a rare pediatric disease. To be eligible for the voucher, that product must be approved, and the application must meet other criteria listed here, including that it must essentially be a new drug, and that drug must, the approval must rely on clinical data derived from studies examining a pediatric population and dosages in the pediatric population. Since 2012, when the program was created, FDA has granted over 560 rare pediatric disease designations and has resulted in granting 28 vouchers. And each voucher represents an approved product for a rare pediatric disease. Of those products, of those vouchers, sponsors have sold many of them, and those prices have gone from $67 to $350 million. And those numbers are large, and that speaks to how valuable the incentive is to sponsors. And hopefully that then works to drive innovation in the rare pediatric disease space. These are the designation trends over the years, and 2020 obviously will stick out as a huge year for requests for designation. The reason for that is that the program was set in statute to sunset in 2020, or at least begin to phase out to a point where designation was required for the sponsor. Congress eventually renewed the program for another 4 years. However, throughout 2020, sponsors were submitting their requests for designation to make sure they got in time. And you can see the huge spike in requests for designation that we received. Moving on to cover the rest of OOPD's programs, the last designation program is for devices, and it's called the Humanitarian Use Device Designation Program, also known as the HUD Designation Program. The goal is to stimulate the development of medical devices for rare diseases. This program uses a different definition of rare disease than the one established in the Orphan Drug Act. To be eligible for HUD designation, a device must be for a disease that is diagnosed in less than 8,000 people per year. And so it's an incidence measure of being a rare disease. If a product is designated as a humanitarian use device, the product then may qualify for the Humanitarian Device Exemption, or HDE pathway. And so the marketing application for this device will be held to the safety and probable benefit standard, which is slightly different from the PMA pathway that devices normally go through. Products that go through this pathway are also held to certain requirements, including the need for an institutional review board, and there's certain profit limitations on devices that are approved through this pathway. Since 1990, FDA has received over 460 requests for HUD designation and granted over 280, and that has led to 78 HDE approvals. And you can see the designation trends here for the HUD program. Moving on to our grants program, the Orphan Drug Act, as I said, created the Orphan Products Grant Program, and that has grown over the years into two different parts. The first part is the Clinical Trials Grant Program. This program provides funding for clinical studies that contribute to market approval for orphan products. The program is appropriated about $15.5 million a year and supports phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. And for phase 1 trials, those may be supported over 3 years, and phase 2 and 3 trials are typically supported over 4 years. Currently, the program is funding about 75 studies per year, with 5.5 million going to new grants and about 10 million going to continuation of grants from the previous years. And this is important to note that while this money is extremely helpful for many products to get off the ground and to support clinical trials, this does not cover the full extent of what it costs to do a clinical trial for a product development. Since the beginning of the program, the program has received 2,800 requests or applications for grants, which is about 100 per year. And the program has funded over 750 studies that have led to about 75 approved products that have been supported by OOPD grants. One example is the Berlin Heart, which is a device for pediatric patients in need of heart transplant. And there's many more stories than that. Next, the Pediatric Device Consortia grant program focuses on pediatric devices. And the goal of this program is to stimulate the development of devices for pediatric patients. The grants fund consortia as opposed to funding direct research and clinical studies. The consortia are networks that work to support pediatric device developers. The program is appropriated about $6 million a year, and we're currently funding 5 pediatric device consortia. Over the years, those consortia have assisted in over 2,000 pediatric device projects that have led to the approval of multiple devices, including 2 listed here. Finally, we have the Natural History Grant Program, and this is the second part of the Orphan Products Grant Program that branches off from the Orphan Drug Act. And the goal of this program is to support rare disease drug development by providing funding for studies that characterize the natural history of rare diseases. The natural history of a rare disease is the expected or predictable course of an untreated illness. And many rare diseases, the natural history is not known, which then makes it extremely difficult to develop products for the rare disease. And so these grants are meant to fund studies that lay the basic knowledge that is necessary to begin to develop products for rare diseases. This program is appropriated about $2 million per year, supports retrospective and prospective studies, and funds about 2 to 5 studies per year. And so, in short, just to sum up, it is a key priority of the FDA to support the development and evaluation of new treatments for rare diseases. Within FDA, OOPD engages with stakeholders in the implementation of the designation and grant programs to drive the development of products for rare diseases and conditions. And so with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Aaron. That was a great talk. Fellows, if you have questions, or viewers, if you have questions, put those into the Q&A of the event stage, and I'll get those, and I'll transfer them on to Aaron. But I was hoping you could, for starters, if you could talk a little bit about the comparable frameworks in other countries, other parts of the world. We've been talking about what's going on with the US FDA. Many of our fellows and viewers today are from Europe, from Asia, from Africa. Are there comparable frameworks in place there with their regulatory agencies?
There certainly are, and FDA does work with other nations, other regions, to share information about how these programs work and help either set up new programs or share feedback on those programs. For example, FDA has a cluster with the EMA in Europe to discuss rare disease issues and orphan issues. And I know that EMA has their own similar but different orphan program. I can't speak to the specifics of different programs in different countries or regions, but FDA is in contact with and supports the programs in other countries as we can.
And companies can apply for a designation from the FDA no matter where they're based from. They don't have to be US companies, right?
Correct, yes. Yes, they don't have to be US based. They'll need a US agent as one of the requirements of orphan drug designation, but we do encourage sponsors, developers, researchers all over the world to request designation.
Okay. Now, we've heard the number a lot over the last couple of days about how only 5% of rare diseases have an approved therapy. What about off-label uses? Is it known how many rare diseases or conditions have an established off-label therapy, something that's kind of medically acceptable, I guess, even though it's not been approved?
We hear that many rare disease patients use existing products off-label, and unfortunately they have to resort to that. And what the FDA prioritizes and what the Orphan Drug Act gets at is trying to have those products that are already approved for other uses, usually for common diseases, incentivizing the studying of those products in the rare disease patients, in the rare diseases specifically. And so the Orphan Drug Act does provide incentives. Even if the drug has a common disease use, we want to be able to see that drug studied in the rare disease patients.
Okay, and this is a very specific question, but you were talking about the sale of the pediatric vouchers, and you actually had price amounts for how much those have been sold for. That kind of surprised me, just because the drug industry, tends to shield a lot of those kind of internal numbers. Is that something to participate in this voucher? Do they have to make it publicly available if they sell it?
The transfer of the voucher, the fact that it's changed hands, I think is needs to be disclosed. I believe those numbers come from voluntary disclosure from the sponsors themselves. Sponsors see the sale of a voucher as a very big incentive, and I think for their business, it's a huge amount of money, and I think they often publicize that.
Okay. All right, we have a question here from the University of Minnesota's Ramya Muthiala, research professor. Can a drug be humanitarian use designation?
That's a good question. The program is specifically for devices, and the designation for humanitarian use means that the device is eligible for the HDE pathway, which is a very specific pathway to be able to market a device. And so the programs are not, the program is not related to drugs and biologics. It's a essentially separate program.
Okay. This is from Bob Rohr, one of our fellows, a freelancer from the United States. Any estimate of the total value of the PDUFA waivers?
Can you repeat that? It was what is the value of the PDUFA waiver?
Any estimate of the total value of the PDUFA waiver?
The marketing application fee right now, I believe, is about $2.9 million. And so if a sponsor is exempt from that, then it's that would be the value there. Now, it's important to note that not all applications are subject to the user fee. For example, supplements, and oftentimes sponsors may seek orphan indications through supplements. And so the waiver of the PDUFA fee doesn't, and sorry, it's not a waiver, it's an exemption. The exemption of the PDUFA fee doesn't necessarily always occur because the application might not have an application, the fee to begin with.
Okay. This question is from David Wahlberg, a fellow of ours from the Wisconsin State Journal in the United States. How much did developing the spinal muscular atrophy drugs, Invirzidi, Zolgensma, and Spinraza, make use of the Orphan Drug Act provisions, and are programs helping people get access to these? And are there programs helping people get access to these expensive drugs?
I can't speak to whether specific drugs, to what extent they utilized orphan drug incentives. I don't. The FDA doesn't really collect that information, and I believe, and the second part of the question was about programs. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Are there programs that help people get access to these expensive drugs?
I'm sure there are. That is not something I can speak to in my role, but I've heard of programs out there. I think it's important that people think about that the rare disease incentives for the Orphan Drug Act are still very vital for most rare disease drug development. And if you speak to patients out there advocating on their own behalf, that the orphan drug incentives are still a vital part of driving energy in the rare disease space.
Now, kind of somewhat related to that same theme, are the requests for rare disease, orphan drug status, orphan drug incentives, are those primarily driven by rare diseases that are being explored for the U.S. population, or are there rare diseases that are coming from non-U.S. or non-European populations, and companies are behind them, even if the population of people who might benefit from it are in the developing world?
We see requests for rare designation. We see requests for orphan drug designation for all types of products treating all various rare diseases, even if the patient populations are not US based.
Okay. This question is from our fellow William Newton of Global Data Healthcare in the US. Is it common for a drug with orphan drug designation to get marketing approval without getting orphan drug exclusivity?
It's not very common. Essentially, if a sponsor has orphan drug designation for their drug and then is approved for an indication within that rare disease, the sponsor generally is eligible for orphan drug exclusivity, unless the same drug has already been approved for the same use or indication. That would be the main reason why a sponsor would not qualify for exclusivity. And that's not very common.
Okay. I was curious to get a little sense of the history. So the Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1983. Has it, you may have covered some of this, but has it been up for reauthorization in that time? And in general, what kind of changes were made at reauthorization time, if that happened? And is it up for reauthorization, anytime in the near future?
Mm-hmm. Were you asking about the Orphan Drug Act or the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation? Oh, okay. The Orphan Drug Act, as you said, passed in 1983, was not time limited. There was no phase out or anything. So there's no need to reauthorize the Orphan Drug Act. However, there have been updates over the years. One I mentioned in my presentation is that the definition of rare disease was refined after about a year of the Orphan Drug Act and experience implementing it and feedback from the FDA and from drug sponsors. And that's the definition that we have today. In addition, over the years, there have been changes to the Orphan Drug Act itself, or more specifically, the Orphan Drug Act created sections within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and those have been updated over the years. One notable addition was a codification of the requirement to demonstrate clinical superiority. In my presentation, I was talking about how that's important to protect the incentive of orphan drug exclusivity and prevent serial exclusivity from follow-on drugs that don't offer anything new to patients. And so Congress implemented how FDA had already implemented the Orphan Drug Act by requiring a demonstration of clinical superiority if the same drug is already approved for the same use or indication. So that's one way where the ODA has been updated over the years to reflect the realities of drug development and protect the incentives that ultimately get these drugs to patients. I'll also note, 'cause I don't know if I noted it during the presentation, that a lot of the incentives related to orphan drug designation are not necessarily outlined or created in the Orphan Drug Act. For example, when the Orphan Drug Act passed in 1983, there were not PDUFA fees. And so the exemption from the PDUFA fee was something that came with time and isn't written into the Orphan Drug Act, but an Orphan Drug Act related incentive.
And for our audience that's not steeped in FDA speak, PDUFA is the, let me see if I actually used to cover this a long time ago, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Or I'm missing something in there. What's it stand for?
Yes, no, that's it.
Okay.
That's it. And there's user fees or marketing application fees for each type of product. And those are regulated by Congress and reauthorized every 5 years.
Okay, and this will be the last question, but I mean, are there, the ways, as you've been describing it, the Orphan Drug Act seems to be, helpful and successful. Are there aspects of it that the advocacy community, the rare diseases advocacy community, or the drug industry are pushing for, modifications or changes? I mean, what are if they could have their wishes to change the Orphan Drug Act to make it more beneficial for the patient community or the drug companies, what might those be?
A lot of ideas have been raised by people with different interests. But if you talk to the rare disease patients and the rare disease advocacy groups, they have found that the Orphan Drug Act has worked and it's worked well, and that they want to be very careful in making any changes to the Orphan Drug Act. Because if you're trying to address a particular issue, it could run the risk of changing how the Orphan Drug Act has worked so well for the vast majority of orphan drugs that have been developed. And so what we hear is that any changes to the Orphan Drug Act need to be very well informed and very well thought out, and that there's not an urgency right now to do that.
Okay. And with that, I think those are all the questions we have. So Aaron, I want to thank you very much for the time and giving us a good overview of how the Orphan Drug Act has worked over the last 30, 40 years. That'll be it for this session right now. We're going to go transition directly into our next session. So this is goodbye for Aaron. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.